In the pre-dawn quiet of a temple storeroom in Uruk around 3200 BCE, an administrator moves through cool, still air. The room is filled with the scent of dry dust and stored barley, a faint, earthy aroma that clings to the mud brick walls. He examines rows of large clay jars, each sealed with a plug of clay and marked to denote its contents and origin. This vast collection of grain represents the collective wealth of the city-state, the product of countless hours of labor from farmers working fields along the Euphrates. The systems developed to manage this surplus were not merely for storage, they were the foundational architecture of a complex society, a way of imposing order on a world of abundance and risk. The central problem facing these early urban centers was the tracking of agricultural wealth. The temple economy functioned as a central clearinghouse, receiving contributions of grain, livestock, and textiles from hundreds of individual producers. Without a reliable method of record-keeping, this system would collapse under the weight of disputes, theft, and simple memory failure. A non-digital database was required to manage the inflow and outflow of goods, ensuring that rations could be distributed to state laborers, that seed grain was set aside for the next planting season, and that offerings to the gods were made on schedule. This administrative need was the primary driver of one of humanity's greatest inventions. The earliest solution involved small clay tokens shaped into distinct forms to represent different commodities. A small cone might signify a measure of barley, while a sphere could represent a larger quantity. A flat disc might stand for a sheep. To record a transaction, a temple official would gather the appropriate number of tokens. For instance, to document a delivery of 10 bushels of grain, the official would take 10 cone-shaped tokens and seal them inside a hollow clay ball known as a bulla. This created a physical, tamper-proof container. The bulla was, in effect, a sealed ledger entry, a tangible representation of a debt or a deposit. A cone token would leave a small conical impression. A disc token would leave a circular mark. The outside of the bulla now served as a table of contents for what was sealed within. It did not take long for an administrator to realize the profound implication of this act. If the impressions on the outside of the bulla accurately represented the tokens on the inside, then the tokens themselves were redundant. The external marks alone were sufficient to carry the information. The physical object representing a bushel of grain was no longer necessary. Only its abstract, two-dimensional symbol was needed. This was the critical cognitive leap from concrete accounting to symbolic representation, the moment a simple inventory system began its evolution into a true form of writing. By 2500 BCE, in a scribal school in the city of Shuruppak, the air is thick with the smell of damp river clay. An apprentice, a boy no more than 10 years old, sits on a reed mat, a flat, wet tablet of clay resting on his lap. In his hand he holds a freshly cut reed stylus, its end sharpened to a triangular point. He concentrates, his brow furrowed, as he carefully presses the corner of the stylus into the soft surface. He is not drawing a line, but making an impression. He practices the basic mark of his craft, a single, clean, wedge-shaped divot in the clay. He repeats the motion over and over, striving for uniformity in depth and angle. His master watches, correcting the boy's grip and posture. Each wedge must be perfect. A sloppy mark could be misread, leading to a critical error in a temple ledger or a royal decree. The boy's entire day is spent on these simple shapes, the fundamental components of a complex and powerful new technology. This script, known as cuneiform from the Latin for wedge-shaped, was the direct descendant of those early token impressions. It was not a language itself, but a versatile system of symbols that could be used to write several different languages. The Sumerians first developed it for their own tongue, a linguistic isolate with no known relatives. Later, the Akkadians, a Semitic people who came to dominate Mesopotamia, adapted the cuneiform script to write their own language. The system of wedges proved flexible enough to represent the distinct sounds and syllables of completely unrelated tongues, ensuring its use for nearly 3,000 years across the ancient Near East. The script itself was a syllabary, with hundreds of signs representing vowel sounds or consonant-vowel combinations. By combining these syllabic signs, a scribe could spell out words phonetically. Other signs, known as logograms, were pictographic in origin and represented entire words, like barley or head. To create a document, a scribe would first prepare the medium. They would take a lump of refined clay, free of sand and pebbles, and knead it with water until it was smooth and pliable. They would then form it into a small pillow-shaped tablet, often sized to fit comfortably in the palm of one hand. With the tablet still wet, the scribe would begin to write, using the reed stylus to press the wedge-shaped marks into the surface. The process required a steady hand and precise control. The orientation of the wedge, vertical, horizontal, or diagonal, and the number of impressions in a cluster determined which sign was being written. The choice of clay as a writing medium had a profound consequence for the preservation of these ancient records. While a papyrus scroll or a wooden tablet might decay, a clay tablet was remarkably durable. If left to dry in the sun, it became hard and difficult to alter, but if the tablet was baked, either intentionally in a kiln or accidentally in the fire that so often consumed ancient cities, it became as hard as ceramic. This process transformed mundane administrative lists and private letters into permanent stone-like objects capable of surviving for millennia buried beneath the rubble of collapsed buildings. For a young scribal apprentice, the permanence of the medium was a source of constant anxiety. The process of learning the hundreds of cuneiform signs was grueling, a matter of rote memorization and endless practice. A mistake made on a wet tablet could be smoothed over, but an error that went unnoticed until the clay had dried was a serious offense. The fear of a misplaced wedge was immense. A single incorrect symbol could turn a receipt for 10 sheep into one for 60, or misrepresent the name of an important official. Such a mistake was not a simple clerical error. It was a disruption of the cosmic and social order, and could result in severe punishment from a temple overseer. A master scribe's day began at dawn with the rhythmic work of preparing his materials. A caravan from the north might deliver sacks of wool. A local farmer would bring in jars of beer or a small herd of goats as his required contribution. Each transaction was meticulously noted. The scribe would press the symbols for the commodity, its quantity, the name of the individual delivering it, and the date. His movements would be quick and efficient, his hand flying across the small clay surface, leaving a neat grid of wedges in its wake. This was the pulse of the city, recorded one tablet at a time. The stylus itself was a simple tool, usually a piece of reed cut from the riverbank. The scribe would shape its end into a sharp, triangular point. The accounting system itself was a form of single-entry bookkeeping, concerned not with profit and loss, but with the physical reality of inventory. Each small tablet was a record of movement, goods in or goods out. The temple needed a precise count of every jar of oil, every sack of barley, and every head of livestock that passed through its gates. This granular, daily tracking was the foundation of the entire state economy. At the end of a set period, such as a month or a season, the information from hundreds of these daily tablets would be transferred to a larger summary record. A master scribe would meticulously compile the data onto a massive multi-columnar tablet, creating a comprehensive ledger. These summary documents organized the flow of goods by type, by responsible official, and by date, transforming a chaotic collection of individual receipts into a coherent economic overview. This ability to aggregate data was the system's true power. For the first time, a centralized authority could see the total assets of the city-state and plan accordingly. Administrators could allocate rations for thousands of laborers, budget resources for massive construction projects, and ensure that the temples had enough grain and livestock for religious festivals. The mundane act of pressing wedges into clay enabled a level of long-term economic planning and social control that had never before been possible. By pressing this point into the soft clay at different angles, he could create the characteristic wedge-shaped marks. A vertical press made one shape, a horizontal press another. A deeper press with the corner of the stylus made a small triangular mark. The entire complex language was built from these few basic repeatable motions. Over centuries, the writing system evolved purely for efficiency. The earliest forms were pictographic. A drawing of a head of barley meant barley, but drawing pictures was slow. Scribes began to simplify and abstract these images, reducing them to a few quick presses of the stylus. The picture of barley became a stylized pattern of wedges. This shift from representing objects to representing sounds and concepts was a monumental leap, turning a simple accounting tool into a true system of writing. The life of a scribe was one of constant, quiet focus. While others toiled in the fields under the hot sun or worked at noisy, dusty crafts, the scribe sat in the relative cool and calm of a temple or palace office. This separation created a distinct social class. Scribes were not laborers, nor were they warriors or priests, but they were indispensable to all of them. Their literacy was a form of power, a closely guarded skill that gave them access to the inner workings of the state. This power, however, came with immense responsibility. An error in a tally of grain could lead to a shortage in the city's rations. A mistake in a legal document could cause a land dispute that might last for generations. The pressure for accuracy was constant. Apprentices, known as tablet house sons, endured years of grueling training, memorizing hundreds of signs and practicing their hand on lump after lump of practice clay. The discipline was severe, as perfection was the only acceptable standard. As the sun began to set, the day's administrative work would be concluded. The scribe would review his collection of damp tablets. Most of these were ephemeral records, daily receipts, short-term work logs, or simple tallies. These tablets would be set aside on a shelf to air dry. Once they had served their purpose, often within a few days or weeks, they would be soaked in a basin of water, the clay dissolving back into a usable slurry, ready to be reformed for another day's accounting. But some tablets were destined for permanence. A royal edict, a significant trade agreement, or the annual inventory of the temple treasury needed to be preserved. These select tablets were carefully carried to a kiln. Here, they were fired at high temperatures, the heat transforming the soft, fragile clay into hard, durable ceramic. This simple act of baking turned a temporary note into a record that could survive for millennia. The final step was archiving. These fired tablets were the permanent memory of the civilization. They were organized and stored in dedicated rooms which functioned as the world's first libraries and archives. Tablets might be stacked on wooden shelves placed in large clay jars or stored in reed baskets. Small clay labels like ancient index tabs were often attached to the containers, noting the contents such as barley receipts, third month or contracts of the House of Ur-Nama, allowing a future scribe to navigate the silent, orderly rows of recorded history. End archives. The Sumerian accounting system was a form of single-entry bookkeeping. There was no concept of debits and credits, profit or loss. Instead, a tablet would simply list commodities received or disbursed. Each entry recorded the quantity of a good, such as jars of beer or bushels of barley, followed by the name of the official who delivered or received it. The system was focused entirely on inventory control and the movement of goods into and out of the temple or palace storerooms. To create a summary of economic activity, a senior scribe would consult a collection of these daily tablets. He would then carefully compile the totals onto a much larger multi-column tablet. This summary document might cover a month, a season, or an entire year. These ledgers provided a comprehensive overview for the high-level administrators who managed the city-state's economy. They could see at a glance the total income from taxes, the expenses for public works, and the reserves held in the granaries. This meticulous tracking allowed for an unprecedented level of economic planning and resource management. Rulers could accurately calculate the amount of seed grain required for the next planting season based on the previous year's harvest and storage. They could also determine precise ration allocations for large teams of public workers building a canal or a ziggurat and calculate the quantity of goods needed for major religious festivals, ensuring social and religious obligations were met without depleting essential reserves. The power derived from this information was immense. It transformed the scribe from a simple clerk into an essential component of the state apparatus, a technocrat whose knowledge was indispensable for the functioning of the kingdom. In many ways, the scribe's stylus was more powerful than a soldier's spear. While an army could conquer territory, it was the organized information on clay tablets that allowed that territory to be governed effectively and its resources to be exploited. Inside the Aduba, the tablet house where young scribes were trained, the air is thick with concentration and the smell of damp clay. A dozen boys, some as young as 10, sit cross-legged on the floor, reciting syllabic charts in a low murmur. The master, a stern senior scribe, moves slowly between them. He inspects their practice tablets, his sharp eyes catching every malformed wedge. For a minor error, a sharp word of correction suffices. For a sloppy tablet, a swift rap across the knuckles with a reed stylus. The curriculum was long and arduous, often taking more than a decade to complete. Students first had to memorize the hundreds of cuneiform signs, from the simple pictographs for ox or grain to the complex phonetic symbols representing syllables. After mastering the script, they moved on to mathematics and the specialized administrative formats. They learned the precise layouts for different types of records: legal contracts, temple inventories, ration lists, and royal correspondence, each with its own strict conventions. The pressure to succeed was enormous. Graduation from the Aduba promised a life of relative comfort and high social standing, a position within the temple or palace bureaucracy, free from the back-breaking labor of the fields. Failure, however, meant a return to that life of manual labor. This was a fate dreaded not only by the students but also by their families, who had often invested heavily in their sons' long and expensive education. The scribe's toolkit was simple but precise. It typically contained several style carved from reeds or bone, with tips of different sizes for making various impressions on the clay. Alongside the style, the scribe kept a lump of fine, wet clay, often wrapped in a damp cloth to maintain its plasticity throughout the day. A small pot of water was also essential, used for smoothing the tablet's surface before writing or for erasing an error with a moistened thumb. The shape of the stylus tip was critical to the entire writing system. A triangular or wedge-shaped profile, when pressed into the soft clay, created the characteristic wedge that gives cuneiform its name. The scribe would alter the angle of the stylus and the pressure of the impression to create the various combinations of horizontal, vertical, and diagonal wedges required by the complex script. A master scribe could form these signs with speed and perfect uniformity. In the Royal Archive at Ebla, a dark, cool room provides refuge from the Syrian sun. The air is dry and still. Wooden shelves, stacked from floor to ceiling, line the walls. On these shelves, thousands of clay tablets are neatly sorted. They are organized by subject and by year, creating one of the world's first large-scale non-digital databases for the king and his administrators. The silence of the room is the silence of stored information, a library of governance. Here lie trade agreements with distant cities, tribute records from vassal states, and the collected wisdom of royal edicts. To navigate this sea of data, archivists would create colophons on the tablets. These were short notes, often inscribed on the edge of a tablet, detailing its contents, the date it was written, and sometimes the name of the scribe who created it. For larger collections, the archivists would also create summary tablets. These functioned as catalogues, listing the contents of a specific shelf or a particular basket of tablets, allowing a researcher to quickly locate a needed record without searching through hundreds of individual documents. These organized archives provided the rulers with a powerful form of institutional memory. They could reference past harvest yields to predict future famines or consult tribute payments from vassal states going back decades. The life of a scribe began in childhood, in a school known as the Adiba, or tablet house. Here, a young boy would spend his days, from sunrise to sunset, learning the intricate cuneiform script. The process was one of endless repetition. He would press a stylus into a lump of wet clay, copying the same signs over and over until the movements became second nature. The atmosphere was one of strict discipline, where the goal was not inspiration but flawless accuracy. The curriculum was built on lists. Students would spend years copying long, standardized lists of everything imaginable: trees and reeds, animals of all kinds, stones, metal objects, articles of clothing, and geographical names. This wasn't about learning natural history. It was about mastering the vocabulary and classification systems needed for administration. By memorizing these lists, the scribe was internalizing the very structure of his world as the state understood it. The primary tool for this work was the stylus. It was typically made from a reed, cut to have a specific triangular or wedge-shaped profile at the tip. Different angles and pressures of this simple tool against clay would produce the various wedge combinations that formed cuneiform characters. A scribe might have several style of different sizes, for making larger signs on a ledger or tiny precise marks on a legal contract. The medium itself, the clay, required careful preparation. It had to be finely levigated to remove impurities like sand or pebbles which could snag the stylus. Then it was kneaded with water to achieve the perfect plasticity, firm enough to hold a sharp impression, yet soft enough to be worked easily. Scribes or their assistants would prepare dozens of these blank tablets, shaping them into small pillow-like rectangles, ready for the day's accounting. With the smooth, damp tablet held in the palm of one hand, the scribe would use the other to press the stylus tip into the surface. The motion was a quick, firm jab, not a fluid stroke like writing with a pen. Each sign was a composite of these individual impressions. This methodical process lent itself to the recording of discrete units of information, 3 wedges for the number 3, followed by the sign for a sheep, followed by the name of a herdsman. If a mistake was made, the process for correction was simple but time-sensitive. While the clay was still wet, an error could be erased by smoothing it over with a wet finger or a flat tool. The scribe could then reinscribe the correct information. However, once a tablet was left to dry in the sun or baked in a kiln for permanence, the text was immutable. The record was set in stone, or rather, in hardened clay. In the great Sumerian cities, these tablets were stored in dedicated archives. These were often rooms deep within temple or palace complexes, their thick mud brick walls insulating the contents from the harsh Mesopotamian climate. With few or no windows, the interior would be dark and cool, a stable environment that helped preserve the unfired clay tablets from crumbling or being damaged by moisture. The air inside would be still and thick with the scent of dry earth and ancient dust. The silence would be broken only by the soft rustle of a scribe or archivist moving through the narrow aisles. Light from a flickering oil lamp would reveal rows upon rows of tablets, not scattered haphazardly, but organized with purpose on wooden shelves, in reed baskets, or tucked into purpose-built clay niches in the walls. To navigate these vast collections, Sumerian archivists developed sophisticated cataloging systems. Baskets containing tablets on a similar subject would be marked with a small inscribed clay tag known as a bulla. This tag might summarize the contents, for example, receipts for silver from the province of Umma, year 7 of King Shulgi. This allowed an official to find the records they needed without examining every single tablet. The process of information retrieval was therefore structured and efficient. An administrator seeking to audit the temple's beer production would go to the archive room, locate the section for commodities, find the baskets pertaining to beer, and then select the one labeled with the correct month and year. The system was a physical manifestation of a logical, hierarchical database. The sheer volume of these records is difficult to comprehend. The archives from the city of Girsu, for instance, held tens of thousands of tablets detailing the economic administration of a single temple over many decades. This was not literature or history in the way we think of it. It was the raw data of a civilization, a meticulous accounting of every transaction, every ration, and every tax payment. This relentless documentation created a powerful sense of permanence and accountability. A debt recorded on a clay tablet could not be easily denied. A labor obligation, once inscribed and filed, became an official fact. This system reduced disputes and provided a stable, predictable foundation for economic and social interactions, all based on the shared reality created by the written record. In the end, this bureaucracy was the skeleton that supported the entire civilization. The rulers who controlled the flow of information, who commissioned the records, managed the archives, and employed the scribes, held the true power. Their authority was built not just on armies or divine right, but on the quiet, methodical work of bookkeepers who ensured that every single measure of grain was accounted for. The great irony of the Sumerian archives is that their creators had no intention of writing history. They were simply managing the present. Yet, in their tireless recording of barley distributions, livestock inventories, and labor assignments, they created one of the most detailed portraits of an ancient society ever discovered. These administrative texts, far more than the epic poems or royal inscriptions, reveal the true rhythm of daily life. They are the unintentional legacy of a civilization built not on grand gestures but on the quiet, persistent, and utterly essential act of counting. Or king lists give us an unfiltered view into the daily operations of their world. The story they tell is not one of gods and heroes, but of a society meticulously organized around the flow of resources, managed by a class of people whose greatest tool was a sharpened reed. The stability provided by these permanent fireproof records was a cornerstone of Mesopotamian civilization. A transaction, once inscribed in clay and baked, became an immutable fact. This permanence created a reliable economic environment where long-term planning, complex contracts, and state-level resource management could flourish over centuries. But this permanence came at the cost of flexibility. A clay tablet could not be easily amended. Correcting an error often required creating an entirely new record, referencing and nullifying the old one. This system, while robust, was cumbersome and slow, a characteristic that would prove disadvantageous as the pace of commerce and conquest quickened in later eras. The invention of administrative writing profoundly stratified Sumerian society. It created a clear division between the literate and the illiterate, giving rise to a new elite class of scribes and bureaucrats. These individuals held immense power not through land ownership or military might, but through their exclusive control over the flow of recorded information. This new hierarchy placed the scribe at the nexus of all major transactions. They were the gatekeepers of the state's memory, essential for everything from temple administration to the legal system. The vast majority of the population, farmers, soldiers, and laborers, remained illiterate, dependent on this specialized class to navigate the increasingly complex text-based world. The formalization of law was a direct consequence of this new technology. Written contracts, authenticated by the impression of personal cylinder seals, became legally binding instruments. This brought a new level of clarity and enforceability to agreements concerning land sales, marriage dowries, and commercial loans. Oral agreements, once the standard, were now secondary to the inscribed word. A dispute over property lines or inheritance could be settled by consulting the archives. Imagine a farmer seeking a loan to buy seed for the spring planting. He would approach a temple scribe who would draw up a clay tablet. The scribe would carefully inscribe the amount of silver being loaned, the agreed-upon interest rate, often a significant percentage of the future harvest, and the date of repayment. Once the terms were recorded, both the lender and the borrower would produce their personal seals. These small, intricately carved stone cylinders were rolled across the wet clay, leaving a unique repeating pattern that served as a legally recognized signature. The tablet was then stored, becoming an unalterable record of the debt. For the illiterate farmer, this entire process was an act of faith, tinged with intimidation. He had to trust that the scribe, a representative of the powerful temple or palace, had accurately recorded the verbal agreement. He could not read the wedges himself. He could only watch as the stylus moved, creating symbols that held power over his future. This dependency created a subtle but pervasive anxiety. The system that provided societal stability also created individual vulnerability. The weight of a debt, the terms of a marriage, or the title to one's land were all locked away in a script that was inaccessible to the very people whose lives it governed. The mathematical system that underpinned this entire administrative machine was sexagesimal, or base 60. Developed out of the practical need for bookkeeping, this system was remarkably versatile. The number 60 has many divisors, making it easy to calculate fractions of goods, labor, and time without resorting to complex decimals. This legacy of the Sumerian base 60 system remains with us today. We still measure time with 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. We divide a circle into 360 degrees. These conventions are direct descendants of the numerical tools created by ancient scribes to manage grain silos and allocate rations. A scribe tasked with calculating the resources for a major public work, such as digging a new irrigation canal, would use this system. Scribes could determine the area of irregularly shaped fields for taxation purposes, or calculate the compound interest on a loan over several years, all using their base 60 system and a clay tablet. This mathematical framework, born from the mundane necessity of counting and dividing, had profound intellectual consequences. It laid the groundwork for the more advanced astronomical and mathematical discoveries of the later Babylonian civilization. The need to manage the present created the tools to understand the cosmos. The precise, systematic thinking required for administration fostered a new kind of analytical thought. The act of breaking down a large problem, like building a ziggurat, into quantifiable units of labor, materials, and time was a revolutionary cognitive leap. It was the quiet work of bookkeepers, not the dramatic pronouncements of kings, that led to some of Mesopotamia's most enduring intellectual achievements. The practical mechanics of their record-keeping inadvertently created the foundation for abstract science. The Sumerian administrative system, with its reliance on durable clay, was perfectly suited to the needs of a centralized, geographically stable temple economy. Its records were permanent, its processes were methodical, and its authority was absolute within the city-state's sphere of influence. However, its very strengths were also its weaknesses. The system was heavy, slow, and required a highly specialized class of scribes. As empires grew more dynamic and geographically vast, the need for a more portable, flexible, and easily learned system of record-keeping became increasingly apparent. In the ruins of a scribal school at the ancient city of Nippur, the wind blows fine sand across the floors. Scattered everywhere are the fragments of clay tablets, the practice exercises of students who lived thousands of years ago. These shattered remnants are all that is left of their diligent work. The once mighty system of cuneiform administration, which had managed empires for 3 millennia, eventually became an archaeological artifact. The skills to read the wedge-shaped script faded, and the vast archives fell silent, their contents a mystery for centuries. The primary reason for this decline was the system's own complexity. Mastering cuneiform required years of dedicated training, making literacy a rare and expensive skill. As trade and communication expanded across the Near East, simpler scripts began to emerge. Alphabetic systems like Aramaic were far easier to learn and use. A merchant could master the basics in weeks, not years. For the practical purposes of daily commerce and correspondence, cuneiform could not compete. It was slowly relegated to the domain of religious scholars and royal inscriptions, a revered but obsolete technology. Yet, even as the intricate wedge-shaped script faded into obscurity, one of the most abstract administrative systems of Mesopotamia demonstrated a remarkable persistence. It was not a method of writing, but a method of counting. The Sumerians and their successors, the Babylonians, developed and used a sexagesimal or base 60 numbering system. This ancient mathematical framework has, against all odds, survived for millennia, embedded so deeply in our modern world that we rarely notice its ancient origins. Every time we look at a clock, we are consulting a Sumerian legacy. The division of an hour into 60 minutes and a minute into 60 seconds is a direct inheritance from the Mesopotamian scribes. The same is true for geometry. The 360 degrees that make up a circle are not an arbitrary number. They are a product of this same base 60 system, a convenient number chosen for its high divisibility, making calculations with fractions much simpler for ancient astronomers and surveyors. It is a quiet, unassuming kind of immortality. The grand temples have crumbled to dust, the names of powerful kings are known only to scholars, and the languages themselves are dead. But the abstract logic used to divide rations of barley and calculate the area of a field has outlasted them all. This mathematical tool, born of the mundane need for bureaucratic order, has become a universal constant in measuring time and space. The choice of base 60 was, like so much in ancient Sumer, intensely practical. The number 60 has an abundance of divisors, making it easy to partition goods and resources without resorting to complicated fractions. A quantity of 60 could be easily divided into halves, thirds, quarters, fifths, sixths, tenths, and twelfths. For a palace administrator tasked with distributing wages or a temple priest overseeing offerings, this was an invaluable feature. This system streamlined the complex arithmetic of a large-scale command economy. Dividing an inheritance, calculating interest on a loan of silver, or planning the labor needed for a canal project all became more manageable. The sexagesimal system was the unseen operating system of Sumerian society, a numerical engine designed for clarity and efficiency in a world managed by lists, ledgers, and inventories written on clay. But while their mathematics echoed through the ages, the civilization itself faced a challenge that no amount of careful accounting could solve. It was a slow, creeping crisis written not on clay tablets but across the land itself. The source of Sumer's wealth was its agriculture, made possible by a vast network of irrigation canals that diverted the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers onto the arid plains. For centuries, this system created an artificial paradise, turning the desert green with fields of wheat and barley. Under the brilliant Mesopotamian sun, the water evaporated quickly from the irrigated fields, but the water from the rivers carried with it a small amount of dissolved mineral salts. As the water vanished into the air, the salt was left behind, accumulating in the topsoil with each passing year. At first, the effect was negligible, but over generations, the concentration of salt in the earth slowly increased. The soil grew toxic. Wheat, the Sumerians' preferred crop, is particularly sensitive to salinity. Year by year, the yields began to fall. The once fertile fields became encrusted with a shimmering white layer of salt, a sterile crust that choked the life from the soil. The scribes in their administrative centers would have meticulously recorded this decline. Their ledgers would show the steady, inexorable drop in the wheat harvest from one generation to the next. They would have noted the desperate shift to growing more salt-tolerant barley. The very act of bookkeeping, the tool of their prosperity, became the means of documenting their own society's slow environmental collapse, one diminished harvest at a time. This shift, documented in the declining grain receipts from southern estates, had profound political consequences. The economic power base of the ancient Sumerian heartland began to erode. Cities like Ur, once the glorious center of a vast empire, found their granaries emptier with each passing decade. The balance of power in Mesopotamia began to drift northward, away from the salt-poisoned fields of the south. Northern regions like Akkad and later Babylon, where the irrigation systems were younger and the soil less damaged, rose to prominence. The clay ledgers of the southern temples, which once recorded immense surpluses and tribute from far-flung territories, would now have told a quieter, more desperate story. A story of scarcity, of failing estates, and of a world slowly fading away, one clay tablet at a time. Sumerian city-states gave way to larger, more centralized kingdoms in Akkad and Babylonia, but the fundamental economic power remained in the fertile south. As the land failed, so too did the political dominance of these ancient cities. Power shifted north to regions like Assyria, where rainfall agriculture was more common and the soil had not been poisoned by centuries of irrigation. The decline of cuneiform itself followed a similar slow path. The intricate system of wedges, once the cutting edge of information technology, was gradually replaced. With the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the script's use dwindled until it vanished entirely, its secrets locked away in silent clay for nearly 2,000 years. The vast administrative archives of Mesopotamia, the daily records of the world's first cities, became unreadable. Imagine an elderly scribe in a temple in the last years of Babylonian independence. He is one of the few who can still fluently read the ancient Sumerian epics and interpret the complex legal codes of Hammurabi. He looks at his grandchildren who speak Aramaic and use a simple alphabet scrawled on parchment. He knows that when he dies, a direct link to 3 millennia of history, science, and literature will die with him. The intricate dance of stylus on clay, a skill that had defined civilization, was becoming a relic. A profound sense of cultural finality must have settled over these last practitioners, the keepers of a dying flame. The story of administration, however, did not end in the dust of Mesopotamia. The very permanence of fired clay, its greatest strength, was also its weakness. It was a medium for a society built around static, centralized temple and palace economies. The future belonged to empires that were more mobile, more commercial, and more geographically dispersed. They required a system of record-keeping that prioritized not permanence but speed, portability, and reusability. We move forward in time to the heart of a new empire. It is the 1st century of the Common Era in the Roman Forum. The air is thick with the noise of 1,000 conversations in Latin and Greek, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, and the rhythmic tread of a legionary patrol marching on the stone pavement. Merchants shout their prices from stalls piled high with goods from across the known world: Egyptian grain, Spanish olive oil, and Gallic wine. A courier, sweating in the Mediterranean sun, pushes his way through the dense crowd. He is not carrying a heavy clay tablet, but a slim set of hinged wooden boards clutched tightly in his hand. He navigates past senators in flowing togas engaged in heated debate on the steps of a temple, and dodges a cart laden with construction materials for a new basilica. His destination is a banker's office tucked away in a side street, a small but vital node in the vast network of Roman commerce. The information he carries is not meant for a permanent archive. It is an urgent financial order that will be executed, recorded, and likely erased by the end of the day. The administrative challenges of the Roman Empire were fundamentally different from those of Sumer. Rome was not a compact network of city-states along two rivers, but a sprawling multicultural territory stretching from Britain to Syria. Its lifeblood was not just stored grain, but constant, rapid commerce and the logistical support of a professional, mobile army. The system of administration needed to reflect this reality. It had to be lightweight enough for a soldier to carry in his pack, fast enough for a merchant to finalize a deal on a bustling dockside, and cheap enough for a student to practice his letters. Clay tablets were far too heavy and cumbersome for this environment. The process of preparing the clay, inscribing the text, and firing the tablet for permanence was too slow for the pace of Roman life. Papyrus, imported from Egypt, was the medium for important documents, literature, and official state records, but it was expensive and susceptible to damage from moisture. For the countless daily ephemeral transactions that powered the empire, the Romans needed something else. They needed a medium that was as temporary and reusable as the transactions themselves. The solution was a simple, elegant, and profoundly practical piece of technology: the wax tablet. Known in Latin as a tabula sciurata, this humble object became the ubiquitous tool of daily administration across the empire. From the soldier on Hadrian's wall noting his duty roster, to the merchant in Pompeii logging a shipment of wine, the wax tablet was the backbone of everyday Roman information management. It was the ancient world's answer to the notepad, the calculator, and the personal digital assistant, all rolled into one. Let us look closely at one. A merchant in his shop just off a busy street in Herculaneum picks up a diptych. It consists of two small rectangular panels of wood, perhaps beech or fir, held together by a simple leather cord passed through holes in the edge, like a book. The outer surfaces are smooth wood, but the inner faces have been hollowed out, leaving a shallow recess with a raised wooden border. This recess is filled with a layer of blackened beeswax, which has been smoothed to a flat, matte surface. It is cool and slightly soft to the touch. Tied to the hinge is a stylus, a thin, pen-like instrument made of bronze or iron. One end of the stylus is sharpened to a fine point. The other end is flattened into a broad, spatula-like shape. The entire object is small enough to be held comfortably in one hand, a self-contained, portable and completely reusable writing kit. It represents a paradigm shift in data management, from the permanence of baked clay to the fluid, erasable nature of wax. The mechanics were straightforward. A person would use the pointed end of the stylus to scratch letters and numbers into the surface of the wax. The pressure of the stylus would displace the dark wax, revealing the lighter-colored wood beneath and creating legible characters. It required no ink, no drying time, and minimal preparation. When the information was no longer needed, the user simply took the flat, spatula-like end of the stylus and smoothed it over the wax surface, erasing the text and creating a clean slate for the next record. To write a note or calculate a sum, a Roman official would hold the tablet in the palm of their left hand and the stylus in their right, much like a modern person holds a small notebook and pen. They would etch the flowing cursive letters of Latin into the wax. The act of writing was a physical inscription, a shallow carving into the soft medium. The process was quick, direct, and intuitive, allowing for the rapid capture of information in any setting, from a noisy courtroom to a military camp. This erasability was the tablet's most revolutionary feature. It was designed for information with a short lifespan. It was perfect for drafting a letter before copying it onto expensive papyrus for sending. It was ideal for a schoolchild practicing their alphabet, able to erase their mistakes and try again endlessly. For a merchant, it was essential for tracking daily accounts, recording loans, and issuing receipts that could be cleared and erased once a debt was paid. The wax tablet created a space for temporary working memory, a concept fundamental to modern computing but just as vital for the ancient mind. A shopkeeper in Ostia, the port of Rome, feels a small sense of order amidst the chaos of a busy market day. A customer has just bought a large amphora of olive oil on credit. The shopkeeper takes his wax diptych, opens it, and with a few quick motions of his stylus, notes the customer's name and the amount owed. The record is instant, clear, and tangible. There is no need to find a spare scrap of papyrus or to create a permanent record for a temporary debt. Tomorrow, when the customer returns to pay, the shopkeeper will simply smooth over the entry with the back of his stylus, the debt settled and the record of it gone, leaving a clean surface for the next day's business. The tablet itself was a simple, elegant piece of technology. A shallow recess carved into a thin slab of wood, often beech or fir, was filled with a layer of darkened beeswax. The dark color, achieved by adding soot or another pigment, provided a high contrast for the lighter scratches made by the stylus. This small, portable object was the ancient equivalent of a personal digital assistant, a ubiquitous tool for anyone needing to manage information on the go. For more complex records, multiple tablets or leaves were bound together. A diptych had 2 leaves, a triptych had 3, and a polyptych could have many more, all hinged together with leather thongs or metal rings. This created a codex, a precursor to the modern book. This simple innovation transformed the single-use slate into a multi-page notebook, capable of holding detailed accounts, lengthy legal drafts, or complex inventories. The system allowed for a logical organization of data. The outer faces of the wood could be left blank or used for a title, while the inner wax surfaces held the content. In a triptych used for a contract, for example, the first and second pages might contain the full text of the agreement. The third page, on the reverse side of the middle leaf, could hold a summary or abstract of the contract, visible without breaking the seals that secured the full document. The process of finalizing a record on a wax tablet was as methodical as its daily use was fleeting. When a document needed to be preserved as a legal instrument, a will, a loan agreement, or a business contract, it was not simply left open to alteration. Witnesses would be called to observe the signing and sealing of the document. Their names would be inscribed on the outer wooden surface of the closed tablet, a public declaration of their role in its creation. The tablets would then be closed, and a thin cord would be passed through holes drilled in the frame, wrapping around the codex to hold it shut. At the knot, a small lump of clay was applied, and each witness, along with the principal parties, would press their signet ring into the soft clay. When the clay hardened, it created a unique set of seals, a security measure that made it impossible to open the tablets and view the full contract without breaking them. This system of sealed witness tablets became a cornerstone of Roman law and commerce. It provided a verifiable, tamper-evident form of documentation that was both portable and relatively inexpensive. A legionary stationed on Hadrian's Wall could receive his pay and sign a sealed wax tablet receipt, a copy of which would be sent back to the administrative offices in London or even Rome. The system created a chain of trust that could span the entire empire. The consequence was a society deeply engaged with written records. The Vindolanda tablets discovered near Hadrian's Wall reveal a world where even soldiers and their families were writing constantly, not just official reports, but personal letters, party invitations, and shopping lists. The wax tablet democratized writing for mundane purposes, making it a tool not just for the elite, but for the everyday administration of life, business, and government. This practical system imbued Roman commerce with a sense of order and predictability. A merchant in Alexandria could ship goods to a partner in Gaul with confidence, knowing the contract, recorded on a sealed triptych, was legally binding and secure. This trust, built upon the simple technology of wood, wax, and string, was the invisible scaffolding that supported the vast and complex economy of the Roman world, providing a quiet reassurance amidst the uncertainties of ancient trade. This trust, built upon the humble foundation of wood and wax, was the lubricant for the vast engine of the Roman economy. The system's reliability meant that contracts were not just promises but provable facts, allowing commerce to flow with a speed and scale previously unimaginable. In the bustling Forum Boarium, Rome's cattle market, a grain merchant from Ostia meets a shipping agent. Their voices are a low hum against the noise of the crowd as they agree on a price for a shipment of Egyptian wheat. The deal is struck not with a handshake alone, but with the production of their personal triptychs. Each man opens his three-leafed tablet. A scribe, hired for a small fee, dips his stylus into the blackened wax of the inner faces. He carefully inscribes the terms, the quantity of grain, the price in sesterces, the name of the ship, and the date of departure. The script is a rapid, flowing cursive, optimized for the medium. Once the terms are written and verified, the inner leaves containing the contract are closed. A thin cord is wrapped around the tablets and passed through bored holes. Witnesses, a nearby stall owner and another merchant, press their signet rings into small lumps of wax applied over the cord, creating unique, unbroken seals. A crucial element of this security was the tablet's outer face. On the exposed wood of the central panel, a brief summary of the contract was written, this time in ink. This allowed a port official or magistrate to understand the nature of the agreement at a glance. The ink summary served as a public label for a private document. The full, legally binding details remained secured beneath the witnesses' seals, but the external note ensured the document could be catalogued and identified without compromising its integrity. Only a magistrate, in the event of a dispute, had the authority to break the seals and read the inner contract. This sophisticated yet practical system of sealed tablets allowed for the creation of secure, portable, and legally enforceable contracts. It was a technology of trust, enabling agreements to be made quickly and with confidence, even between strangers in a crowded marketplace. The impact extended across the vast distances of the empire. A landowner in Hispania could forward a sealed tablet detailing a shipment of olive oil to a buyer in Ephesus. The tablet itself, traveling with the cargo, was the legal instrument, a physical manifestation of a commercial bond that held fast across provinces and seas. The same qualities that made the wax tablet indispensable to commerce, its portability, reusability, and suitability for temporary records, also made it a vital tool for another pillar of Roman society, the military. The administrative needs of a legion were as constant and demanding as those of any large trading company. From the sun-scorched deserts of Syria to the damp forests of Germania, the Roman army was an institution run on information. The flow of data from the lowest-ranking units to the highest echelons of command was constant, and the wax tablet was the primary medium for its daily transmission. Imagine a wind-swept stone fort along Hadrian's Wall in northern Britannia. A persistent cold drizzle slicks the palisade walls. Inside the commander's office, the only light comes from a flickering oil lamp casting long shadows across stone walls and wooden furniture. A military clerk, the Actarius, sits hunched over a large codex made of multiple wooden tablets bound together. He shivers, pulling his woolen cloak tighter. The only sound in the room is the faint, rhythmic scratching of his bronze stylus against wax as he updates the century's duty roster. His breath mists in the cold air as he meticulously carves the names of sentries assigned to the night watch. He corrects a misspelled name with the flat end of his stylus, smoothing the wax before carefully reinscribing the letters. Every detail had to be perfect. The efficiency of the fort depended on it. The Roman legions were managed with a level of bureaucratic precision that was itself a weapon of war. Every aspect of a soldier's career was documented: enlistment date, pay grade, issuance of equipment, promotions, punishments, and periods of leave. This vast quantity of data was managed using a two-tiered system. The wax tablet was the tool for daily transient information, duty rosters, patrol reports, and daily strength counts. For permanent records such as pay ledgers and service histories, this information was periodically transferred to more durable papyrus rolls which were stored in the legion's archives. The process began each morning at the unit level. A centurion would take a small diptych and note the number of men present and fit for duty in his century. He would also record any soldiers assigned to special tasks, on sick leave, or confined to the barracks for disciplinary reasons. This small tablet would then be carried by an orderly to the administrative office, where the Actarius would collect the reports from every century in the cohort. He would then compile this information onto his larger codex, creating a comprehensive daily strength report for the entire legionary command. This systematic, near-real-time collection of data provided Roman commanders with an unparalleled clarity of their forces' operational readiness. At any given moment, a legate could know the exact number of fighting men available, the status of their equipment, and the amount of supplies on hand. This administrative efficiency was a profound strategic advantage. It allowed for precise logistical planning, ensuring that food, weapons, and wages could be allocated and distributed with minimal waste. An army that could accurately count its own spears and feed its own men was an army that could outlast its opponents. Far from the northern frontier, in a quiet courtyard in Lugdunum, Gaul, a young boy sits with his tutor. His face is a mask of concentration and frustration. He holds a stylus, its grip unfamiliar in his small hand, and attempts to form a letter in the smooth wax of his tablet. He scratches a clumsy B, the lines uneven. The tutor points out the error with a nod. With a sigh, the boy flips the stylus and uses the flat spatula end to smear the wax smooth. erasing his mistake. He takes a breath and tries again, the repetitive cycle of writing and erasing a core part of his education. For countless children across the Roman world, the wax tablet was the first and most fundamental tool of learning. Its inherent reusability made it the ideal medium for the endless practice required to master reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. Unlike expensive papyrus, a wax tablet could be used again and again, making education accessible beyond the wealthiest elite. A single tablet could serve a child for years, from their first hesitant letters to the memorization of Virgil and the calculation of sums. This affordability and practicality contributed to a level of functional literacy that was significantly broader than that of ancient Sumer. While deep scholarship remained the domain of a few, the ability to read a simple notice, write a name, or calculate a price was a skill possessed by many merchants, soldiers, and landowners. The consequence of this broader literacy was a decentralization of administration. The Roman state did not need to rely exclusively on a small, highly trained caste of scribes to manage its affairs. Local officials, guildmasters, and foremen on large estates could keep their own records, manage their own logistics, and communicate in writing, creating a more resilient and efficient administrative fabric. Nowhere was this administrative efficiency more critical than in the Roman military. The legions were not just fighting forces. They were vast, mobile organizations that required meticulous logistical planning. The widespread literacy among officers, even non-commissioned ones like centurions, meant that record-keeping could be handled at the unit level. Each century maintained its own duty rosters, pay records, and inventories of equipment, from swords and shields down to individual hobnailed sandals. This distributed system of administration made the legions incredibly resilient and adaptable. A cohort garrisoned on a remote frontier could manage its own supplies, process its own paperwork, and maintain order without constant oversight from a central bureaucratic hub. The daily reports, scribbled onto wax tablets or wooden leaves, were the mundane lifeblood of the Roman war machine. This quiet, unassuming administrative competence was as vital to Rome's success as the discipline of its soldiers in battle. For the Roman child, this journey into the world of letters and numbers was often a monotonous and demanding experience. The primary mode of instruction was rote memorization and endless repetition. The daily routine was one of copying letters, chanting multiplication tables, and reciting passages of text until they were known by heart. The goal was not understanding in a deep sense, but perfect, unwavering recall. The atmosphere of the Roman school, or ludus, was typically severe. Discipline was strict, and the schoolmaster's rod was a common tool for correcting errors or inattention. Education was seen as a process of shaping and molding, of instilling the discipline necessary for a productive life in a highly ordered society. The student was not an active collaborator in their own learning, but a passive recipient of established knowledge. The educational path began around the age of 7 at the ludus, where a teacher known as a literator taught the fundamentals. Here, children would spend their days tracing the shapes of letters on their wax tablets, learning their sounds, and slowly combining them into syllables and then words. At the same time, they would learn basic arithmetic, often using an abacus or a counting board, mastering the simple calculations needed for commerce and daily life. For boys of the upper classes, the next stage, beginning around age 12, was the school of the Grammaticus. This was a far more advanced and demanding curriculum focused on the mastery of literature and language, primarily Latin and Greek. The core of this education was the detailed study of the great poets such as Homer, Horace, and above all, Virgil. The work in the Grammaticus's school was painstaking. Students would not simply read the Aeneid, they would dissect it. Each line was analyzed for its grammatical structure, its rhetorical devices, and its metrical rhythm. The teacher would expound upon the historical and mythological allusions, ensuring that the students absorbed not just the text, but the entire cultural universe it represented. The ultimate consequence of this rigorous system was the creation of a remarkably uniform ruling class. An educated Roman, whether from Spain, Gaul, or North Africa, shared an identical intellectual foundation. They had all memorized the same passages of Virgil, struggled with the same Greek grammatical forms, and been trained in the same principles of rhetoric. This shared cultural and intellectual framework was a powerful unifying force across the empire. It ensured that administrators, governors, and officers, regardless of their geographic origins, operated from a common set of assumptions and values. This educational system, in its own quiet and methodical way, was one of the most important administrative tools the Romans possessed, producing the very men who would go on to manage the empire's vast and complex machinery. This uniformity of thought and culture bred a predictable and reliable administrator. The very reusability that made the wax tablet an ideal tool for learning and daily administration is precisely why so few of these records survive. Each smoothed-over surface represented a piece of lost history, a transaction erased, a lesson learned and then wiped away forever. This impermanence presents a profound challenge for historians. The vast majority of the empire's daily mundane records simply vanished. The few examples that have survived, preserved by freak environmental conditions, therefore offer a uniquely powerful and intimate glimpse into the machinery of Roman life, a window opened by pure chance. Near Hadrian's Wall, at the archaeological site of Vindolanda, a conservator carefully works in the damp, peaty soil. With a delicate brush, they clear away the earth from a sliver of wood no thicker than a playing card. It is not a wax tablet, but something even more fragile, an ink leaf tablet, a piece of personal correspondence from the edge of the Roman world. The Vindolanda tablets were a cheaper, more disposable alternative to their wax-filled counterparts. Made from thin, postcard-sized sheets of birch or alder wood, they were written on directly with a carbon-based ink. Buried in the oxygen-free, waterlogged ground beneath the fort, hundreds of these documents were miraculously preserved from decay. One of the most famous tablets is a birthday party invitation written in a flowing cursive script. Claudia Severa, the wife of a nearby fort's commander, invites her friend Sulpicia Lepidina to celebrate on September 11th. This simple note provides priceless information about the social lives of elite women on the frontier and the level of literacy among them. Reading these messages creates a powerful connection across the centuries. The concerns feel startlingly modern and human. A soldier writes home asking his family to send him warmer socks. A supply officer complains about the poor quality of the local beer and the laziness of the native Britons. These are not grand imperial pronouncements, but the authentic voices of ordinary people. The widespread use of these simple writing tools fostered a society that ran on documented information. This was a key element of Roman administration. Public notices were posted in the forum for all to see. Laws were inscribed on bronze and stone, and contracts were recorded and witnessed. For the average citizen, interaction with the state was often mediated through a document: a soldier's discharge papers, a tax receipt, a certificate of citizenship. These were not abstract concepts but physical objects that defined one's legal standing and obligations within the vast imperial system. The Roman state's central archives, the tabularium, housed vast collections of records on more permanent papyrus rolls. But the raw data that fed this immense bureaucratic engine was first captured on thousands of these humble tablets by officials scattered across the provinces. The wax tablet was the entry point for the empire's great database. A provincial governor's financial officer, the quaestor, would use tablets to collect tax data from local magistrates. These figures, representing harvests, property values, and head counts, would be compiled onto a summary tablet. This summary would then be transcribed onto a papyrus scroll for the long journey to Rome, where it would be logged in the central treasury records. This system of distributed temporary data collection feeding into a permanent centralized archive was remarkably efficient for its time. It allowed Rome to manage a continent-spanning empire with a relatively small bureaucracy, but it relied entirely on a shared system of writing. What would an empire do if it had to manage complex data without any writing at all? We shift forward in time and across the globe to the high Andes of modern-day Peru around the year 1450. The air is thin and cold. A young man, a chasqui, runs at a steady pace along a meticulously paved stone road that clings to the mountainside. In his hand he carries not a tablet or a scroll, but a cluster of knotted cords of various colors. This is a quipu. The Inca Empire, which they called Tawantinsuyu, was a marvel of engineering and social organization stretching over 2,000 miles along the spine of South America. It was vast, populous, and complex, yet uniquely among the great civilizations of history, it possessed no system of writing. Their entire empire was administered using these knotted strings. This complete absence of writing forced an entirely different approach to information management. Every piece of administrative data, census figures, warehouse inventories, tribute obligations, and historical records had to be encoded in a purely numerical and tactile format. The quipu was not a supplement to writing, it was the entire system. The anatomy of a quipu was deceptively simple, yet capable of immense complexity. It began with a primary cord, thick and sturdy, from which hung numerous thinner pendant cords. Sometimes these pendant cords had their own subsidiary cords branching off, allowing for hierarchical data structures. Information was encoded in three primary ways: the color of the cord, the type of knot tied, and the position of the knot on the cord. The colors were not merely decorative, they were a form of categorization. A yellow cord might represent gold or maize. A white cord could signify silver or peace. Red might stand for soldiers or war. The specific meanings could vary by region or by the context of the quipu itself, requiring a shared understanding between the creator and the reader of the data. The knots themselves represented numbers. The Inca used a base 10 or decimal system, identical to the one we use today. The position of the knot on the pendant cord determined its value. Knots at the very bottom represented the one's place. Those a little higher up were the tens, then the hundreds, and so on. A space was left empty to represent the number 0. 3 different types of knots were used. A simple single knot was used for most digits. A long knot with multiple turns was used to represent the numbers 2 through 9 in the ones place, making the lowest value easy to read quickly by touch. And a figure-8 knot was often used to represent the number 1. This tactile distinction was crucial for an information system that could be read in low light or even by feel alone. The individuals who could create and interpret these complex devices were known as quipu kamayoks, which translates to knot keepers or knot makers. They were the accountants, scribes, and historians of the empire, a highly trained and respected class of civil servants. From a young age, they were taught the intricate systems of color coding and knot tying, memorizing the specific meanings and conventions used for their region and their subject matter. A quipu kamayok was not just a human calculator, they were the living memory of the data. While the quipu held the numbers, the quipu kamayok held the context. They would present the quipu to a government official and verbally explain what the numbers represented. This yellow cord shows the maize harvest from that particular village. This red cord with the subsidiary cords details the number of soldiers from this province, broken down by age. This marriage of the physical data device and the trained human interpreter was the core of the Incan administrative system. It created a powerful check and balance. The quipu provided an objective, unchangeable record of the numbers, while the quipu kamayok provided the essential narrative and context that brought the numbers to life. Without both, the information was incomplete. To move this information across the vast and rugged terrain of the Andes, the Inca built a legendary road network, and along it they established the Chasqui relay system. These were elite runners, trained to cover great distances at high speed. A Chasqui would run a set leg of the journey, carrying the quipu, before passing it to the next runner waiting at a small station called a tambo. Through this continuous relay, information could travel across the empire with astonishing speed, sometimes covering over 150 miles in a single day. A governor in a distant province could send a detailed inventory of his storehouses encoded on a quipu and have it arrive in the capital of Cusco in a matter of weeks. This allowed the Sapa Inca, the emperor, to have a near real-time understanding of his domain's resources. The data recorded was breathtaking in its scope. Quipus tracked the census of every village, not just by total population, but broken down by age and sex, allowing the state to calculate its labor tax obligations. They recorded agricultural yields, the number of llamas and alpacas in state herds, and the contents of the vast storehouses or kolkes that dotted the empire. These storehouses were a key element of Incan economic stability. In years of good harvest, surplus food and textiles were collected as tribute and stored. In times of famine or disaster, the goods could be redistributed to the affected areas. This complex system of collection and redistribution was managed entirely through the data provided by the quipus, a form of sophisticated state-level logistics. Just as in Rome, the system was hierarchical. A local administrator would record the production of a few dozen households on a simple quipu. This would be carried to a district center, where a quipu kamayok would aggregate the data from several local quipus onto a larger, more complex summary quipu. This process would repeat at the provincial level until a master quipu arrived in Cusco, representing the data for an entire quarter of the empire. The tactile, three-dimensional nature of this data storage had a profound effect. Information was not an abstract concept on a flat page, it was a physical object. An administrator could literally hold the census of a province in their hands, feeling the weight and complexity of the cords and knots. It was a tangible representation of the state's power and knowledge. While most surviving quipus appear to be purely numerical, recording statistics, there is ongoing debate among scholars about whether some could have encoded narrative information as well. Some theories suggest that combinations of colors, chord-plying direction, and knot types could have represented syllables or concepts, forming a kind of knot writing. This remains a controversial but fascinating possibility. Ultimately, the system's greatest strength was also its greatest vulnerability. It was entirely dependent on the specialized, memorized knowledge of the Quipucamayos. When the Spanish conquest shattered the Incan state, this institutional knowledge began to fade. The conquerors, unfamiliar with the system and suspicious of its use, often destroyed the quipus. Within a few generations, the ability to read these intricate records was lost, silencing the voices of an entire empire's administration. The loss of the quipu readers meant that the history of the Inca Empire would forever be told by its conquerors. The Spanish chroniclers who documented the civilization they were dismantling provided invaluable accounts, but their perspective was that of an outsider, often clouded by misunderstanding, religious bias, and political justification. They recorded the sagas of kings and battles, the glimmer of gold, and the progress of religious conversion, but the intricate daily workings of the empire, the subtle mechanics of its economy, and the granular details of its social contract were largely lost in translation or deemed unimportant. The surviving quipus, housed in museums around the world, are a profound and silent testament to this lost knowledge. They represent one of history's great data gaps. We are left with the equivalent of a national archive whose language has been forgotten. The precise accounting of every llama, every bushel of maize, every day of labor owed to the state, the very information that formed the bedrock of Incan power and stability, is now an unsolvable puzzle. The administrative voice of an entire empire has been reduced to a whisper encoded in silent, indecipherable knots. The mundane administrative data, the census figures, warehouse inventories, and tribute obligations could not be recorded in narrative form. Without a written script, all information had to be encoded in a purely numerical and tactile format. This fundamental constraint demanded a completely different cognitive approach to information management, one based not on letters and words but on position, texture, and quantity. The quipu was the Inca's extraordinary solution to this challenge. It was a sophisticated three-dimensional database, a portable and durable device that allowed for the meticulous management of millions of people and vast resources across the empire's challenging mountain landscape. An official, a Quipucamayok, holds up a quipu. A thick primary cord, sometimes several feet long, serves as its backbone. From this main cord hang dozens, sometimes hundreds, of thinner pendant cords. These pendant cords are of different colors, spun from the soft wool of llamas and alpacas or the fibers of cotton plants. Each one is covered in a series of intricate, carefully spaced knots. The system was a positional decimal one, elegant in its simplicity. The type of knot and its position on the cord indicated its value. Knots tied at the very bottom of a pendant cord represented the one's place. Those a little higher up were the tens, then the hundreds, and so on. A space with no knot in a particular position simply meant zero. A Quipucamayok would read the device through a combination of touch and sight. They would run their fingers along the pendant cords, feeling the shape and number of knots to register their value. while the specific color of the cord would signify the item being counted: yellow for maize, red for soldiers, white for silver. This tactile and visual system could store immense amounts of quantitative data with remarkable density. A single complex quipu could record the complete census data for a village, detailing the number of men, women, and children and their respective labor obligations to the state. A young Quipu Kamayok, newly appointed to his position, feels the immense weight of his responsibility. The data held in the knots of his quipu is the lifeblood of his community. An error in tying a knot, a misremembered color code, could mean his village starves or is punished for failing to meet a tribute that was never owed. The Quipu Kamayoks were the professional accountants and historians of the Inca Empire. They were a specialized elite class, trained from a young age in the demanding art of creating and interpreting the knotted cords. Their own memory was as crucial an element of the system as the knots themselves. The quipu was an inert tool without the living knowledge of its keeper. While the quipu stored the numbers, the quipu kamayok had to memorize the essential context. They knew through oral tradition and rigorous training that the yellow cord on a specific quipu from the village of Paucartambo referred not just to maize in general, but to the 240 bushels from the last harvest stored in the second silo. This created a deeply integrated system of human and device data storage. The quipu was the hard drive, holding the raw numbers, but the Quipu Kamayok was the operating system, the living software that could access, interpret, and give meaning to that data. From military logistics to agricultural planning, the Quipu was the central tool of imperial administration. A massive stone storehouse, a kulkar, sits on a cold, dry mountainside, its position carefully chosen to preserve its contents. Inside, an administrator directs workers as they store freeze-dried potatoes and carefully folded textiles. He consults a quipu, its cords dangling from his hand, to track the new inventory. The system was based on a decimal, or base 10, system, much like the one we use today. The knots tied into the pendant cords represented numbers. The position of a knot on a cord determined its value. Knots at the very bottom of a cord represented the one's place. Further up were the tens, then the hundreds, and so on, up to the 10,000's place. The type of knot also mattered. A simple single knot might represent the number 1. For numbers 2 through 9, a special long knot was used, with the number of turns in the knot indicating the specific digit. A knot with 4 turns, for instance, in the tens position, would represent the number 40. The absence of a knot in a specific position signified a 0, a conceptually advanced idea that was crucial for the system's accuracy. This layered system of color, cord placement, knot type, and knot position allowed for the recording of immense quantities of data. A single quipu could contain hundreds of cords and thousands of knots, encoding everything from census data and tax obligations to the contents of warehouses and the movements of armies. It was a physical database, a spreadsheet woven from cotton and camelid fiber. The consequence of this system was a form of literacy without writing. The Inca state could manage complex logistics and long-term planning with a level of detail that would be impossible for a purely oral society. This made the training and succession of these specialists a matter of extreme state importance. Imagine the life of a Quipu Kamayok. It was a life of immense responsibility and quiet pressure. They were the memory of the state, the guardians of its facts and figures. In their minds they carried the weight of harvests, the names of families, the debts of provinces. A single forgotten detail, a single misinterpreted knot could lead to famine, injustice, or strategic disadvantage. Their status in society was elevated. They were exempt from common labor and taxes, supported by the state they served. Yet this was not a role of public acclaim. It was a discipline of precision and discretion carried out in administrative centers, away from the fanfare of the court or the chaos of the battlefield. Their work was the silent, invisible scaffolding that held the empire together. The Quipucamayocs were organized into a strict hierarchy. Local accountants in a village would record local production and population data. These records would then be carried by runners, known as chasquis, along the vast network of Inca roads to a regional center. There, a higher-ranking Quipucamayoc would aggregate the data from multiple villages onto a summary quipu. This process continued up the chain of command, with data becoming more and more consolidated as it traveled towards the capital, Cusco. At the very top, the most senior Quipucamayocs presented these master records to the Sapa Inca himself. This allowed the emperor to have a constantly updated bird's-eye view of his entire domain, from the number of soldiers in a distant garrison to the yield of the potato harvest in a high-altitude province. This system of data aggregation was remarkably efficient. It filtered out unnecessary local detail while preserving the essential information needed for imperial decision-making. The Sapa Inca didn't need to know how many chickens each family owned, but he did need to know the total tribute owed by the province and whether they could meet their quota. The physical transfer of this information was an administrative marvel in itself. A chasqui runner carrying a quipu and a spoken message to provide context would race along a segment of the Inca road system. These runners were stationed in small relay posts, or tambos, spaced every few kilometers. Upon reaching the next tambo, the runner would pass the quipu and the message to a fresh runner, who would immediately sprint to the next post. Orders for troop movements could be dispatched back with equal speed. This rapid communication gave the centralized Inca government an immense advantage in managing its vast and often rugged territory. This system of runners and knots was the Incan equivalent of the telegraph or the internet. It bound the sprawling empire together, overcoming the immense challenges of Andean geography. It allowed for a level of centralized control and rapid response that was unprecedented in the pre-Columbian Americas. The Quipucamayoc, then, was not an isolated accountant, but a vital node in a much larger administrative machine. This machine was composed not just of knotted cords and human memory, but of physical infrastructure. The entire system depended on the remarkable engineering and organizational prowess of the Inca state. The famous Inca road system, the Capac Ñan, was not built primarily for common travel or trade. It was the artery of the state, a highway for armies, officials, and above all, for information carried by the chasquis. The storehouses, the relay stations, the administrative centers, all were integral parts of this data-driven empire. This intricate system of management unfolded across one of the most challenging landscapes on Earth. From the dry coastal deserts to the humid jungle fringes and the breathtakingly high peaks of the Andes, the Inca imposed a rational order. Their administration was a testament to human ingenuity, a way of weaving control and coherence into a world of dramatic verticality and climatic extremes. The Quipucamayoc's work, therefore, was the very foundation upon which this grand imperial structure rested. The knotted cords they so carefully tied and read were not mere records, they were the lifeblood of the state. They were the raw data that informed every major decision, from the levying of tribute to the deployment of armies and the distribution of food during a drought. The Quipucamayok was the human interface for this data, a living repository of the empire's memory and its current state of affairs. Their ability to accurately interpret and communicate this information was as crucial as the road system or the granaries themselves. This reliance on a specialized class of record keepers created a system built on immense trust. Since the Quipu could not be read by the common person or even by many officials, the empire was completely dependent on the honesty and skill of its accountants. They were the guardians of the state's most vital secrets and its most mundane truths. This position of trust likely afforded them a high status within the rigid Inca hierarchy, but it also came with the heavy burden of responsibility. An error in their records or a deliberate falsification could disrupt the delicate balance of redistribution and reciprocity that held the empire together. Imagine the setting for this meticulous work. It took place not in dusty archives, but in stone administrative centers perched high in the Andes. The air is thin and crisp, the sun intense in a deep blue sky. Outside, stone-paved roads cut across breathtakingly steep mountainsides, and agricultural terraces descend like giant staircases into deep valleys. The world is one of verticality, of stark contrasts between sun-scorched rock and irrigated green patches. It is a landscape of immense power and beauty, but also one of profound challenges for human civilization. This environment was not merely a backdrop to the Inca administration, it was the primary reason for its existence. Inside one of the massive stone storehouses called Kulkas, built on a cold, dry mountainside, the air is still and smells of earth and dried grain. An administrator, wrapped in woven textiles, directs workers as they stack freeze-dried potatoes and carefully bundled ears of maize. In his hands, he holds a quipu, its colored strings a perfect ledger of the contents of this building, a single node in the empire's vast logistical network. The entire Inca economy functioned without currency. It was a sophisticated system of command and redistribution, powered by a labor tax known as the MITA. The state required a precise method for tracking every single resource, from the bushels of quinoa in a distant storehouse to the number of soldiers available in a particular province. The quipu was the technology that made this centralized control possible. It was the empire's operating system, a tangible representation of its wealth and obligations. This data collection was hierarchical and systematic. A local official, a curaca, would use a small quipu to record the population of his village, noting births, deaths, and the ages of its inhabitants. This quipu would then be physically carried by a runner along the Inca road system to a regional administrative center. There, a higher-ranking Quipucamayok would aggregate its data with information from dozens of other villages, tying new knots onto a larger summary quipu. This pyramid of information flowed all the way to the capital, Cusco. The Sapa Inca and his council could consult these master quipus to gain a detailed quantitative overview of the entire empire, known as Tawantinsuyu, the four parts together. With this data, they could mobilize armies with precise knowledge of their numbers, organize massive public works projects like roads and temples, and efficiently distribute food from state granaries to regions suffering from famine or crop failure. Beyond these clear numerical records, a significant debate continues among scholars. Could the quipu also record narrative information? It's hypothesized that subtle variations in color, the direction of the ply of the string, whether it was an S twist or a Z twist, and the specific type of knot used could have functioned as a form of symbolic or even syllabic code. Each combination could represent a concept, a name, or a piece of a story, turning the strings into a readable text for those who knew the system. If such a narrative code existed, its loss represents one of the great intellectual tragedies of history. It would be akin to an entire library filled with the records of a major world civilization being rendered unreadable. The administrative archives, the royal histories, the epic poems, and the legal codes of the Inca Empire may be physically present in museums today, locked away in silent knots. These artifacts, which we currently understand only as numerical ledgers, could hold the voices of Inca historians and poets. They might contain the detailed laws that governed their society or the founding myths passed down through generations. Without the key to this potential code, they remain tantalizingly close yet incomprehensible, a vast repository of knowledge that has been effectively erased. The fate of this intricate system of knotted cords was ultimately sealed by the arrival of a civilization with a profoundly different approach to information. The Spanish brought with them a technology based not on memory and touch, but on the power of the alphabet and the permanence of ink on paper. The scene is Cajamarca in the year 1532. A Spanish conquistador, clad in steel armor, holds a captured quipu. He turns it over in his hands, looking at the complex arrangement of knots and colored strings with a mixture of confusion and deep suspicion. To his eyes, this is not a sophisticated database. It is a strange, incomprehensible object, perhaps a tool for pagan idolatry or witchcraft. The Spanish conquest systematically dismantled the quipu system. The specialized Quipucamayocs were killed in the fighting, died from new diseases, or were scattered, breaking the fragile chain of oral tradition and memory required to interpret the knots. The new colonial administration had no use for them. It demanded records be kept in Spanish, using alphabetic script on paper. In their effort to supplant the old order, Spanish officials, particularly priests, ordered the destruction of vast numbers of quipus. They viewed them as tools of a rival power structure and symbols of a pagan religion. This systematic burning was an act of profound administrative and cultural destruction, effectively lobotomizing the Inca state's memory and severing its connection to its own history. Imagine the quiet despair of the last generation of Quipucamayocs. They were the inheritors of centuries of knowledge, trained from childhood to see a rich tapestry of data in a bundle of strings. They watched as their entire life's work, the administrative framework of their civilization, was rendered meaningless, discarded, and actively destroyed. Their vast, tactile knowledge, which had managed an empire across the Andes, had no place in the new world being violently born around them. The debate continues among scholars as to whether quipus were purely numerical or if they contained what we would call narrative information. Some theories propose that certain combinations of knots, colors, and chord placements could have represented syllables, words, or concepts, forming a true three-dimensional writing system. If this were true, then the destruction of the quipus was not just the burning of ledgers, it was the burning of libraries. It was the obliteration of histories, poems, and genealogies that we can now never recover. The Spanish, in their quest to erase an administrative system, may have unknowingly destroyed a unique form of literature, silencing a voice from the past before it could ever be fully understood by the outside world. The ambiguity itself is a kind of tragedy. because the key to deciphering them, the oral knowledge of the Quipucamayox, is gone, we are left to speculate. The knotted strings remain, for the most part, silent witnesses to a system so complex and so foreign to alphabetic minds that its full potential may be lost to us forever. This transition from a functioning, intricate system to a void of knowledge highlights a universal vulnerability. Any administrative apparatus, no matter how sophisticated, is only as resilient as the people who maintain it and the medium they use. The Inca system, so perfectly adapted to its environment and culture, was brittle when faced with an outside force that did not recognize its value. Its collapse was not a slow decay, but a rapid amputation. The central brain of the empire, which processed information through knotted cords, was removed, and the body was left to falter. The story of the Quipu's demise is a stark reminder that the mundane tools of bureaucracy are the very skeleton upon which a civilization is built. When they break, the entire structure comes down. In the years that followed, the physical landscape of the Andes began to reflect this administrative breakdown. The great Inca roads, once meticulously maintained by organized labor crews, began to crumble. Stone paving was washed away by seasonal rains, and suspension bridges made of woven grass were no longer repaired, their sagging forms hanging precariously over deep gorges. The vast agricultural terraces, marvels of engineering that climbed the steep mountainsides, started to fall into disuse. Without the central authority to manage the complex irrigation canals that fed them, sections dried up or were destroyed by landslides. The once green steppes that fed an empire slowly began to be reclaimed by the wild mountain vegetation. The collapse was systemic because the Inca state was profoundly centralized. Local economies and communities were not self-sufficient. They were specialized cogs in a vast imperial machine. One region might produce maize, another potatoes, another wool, all under the assumption that the central administration would collect the surplus and redistribute it according to need. When the Spanish shattered that central authority, the redistribution network vanished. The flow of goods along the Inca road system ceased. A community that specialized in weaving might suddenly have a surplus of textiles but no way to trade for food. The intricate economic interdependence, once the empire's greatest strength, now became its fatal weakness. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Without the state-managed storehouses or tampas being regularly resupplied, local famines became a real and terrifying threat. A single bad harvest, which in the past would have been mitigated by drawing from imperial reserves, could now wipe out a whole community. The social safety net, woven from threads of obligation and redistribution, had been torn apart. The common people were now subject not to the predictable, if demanding, labor tax of the Inca, but to the often arbitrary and far more extractive demands of individual Spanish encomenderos, who sought personal wealth rather than the balanced functioning of an empire. For the millions of people living within the former empire, this was more than a political change. It was the dissolution of their known universe. The cosmic order, with the Sapa Inca as the son of the sun at its center, had been shattered. The predictable cycles of planting, harvesting, state labor, and religious festivals were thrown into chaos. A quiet, deep-seated uncertainty replaced the structured rhythm of life. The trust that the state would provide, that the storehouses would be full, that the roads would be safe, was gone. It was the quiet anxiety of watching a world unravel, of seeing the meticulously maintained systems that ordered every aspect of existence simply cease to function, leaving a void filled with hunger and fear. The new system imposed by the Spanish was not just different, it was fundamentally incomprehensible to the Andean people. It was a system based on written documents in a foreign language, on concepts of private property and debt that were alien to the communal and reciprocal nature of their society. The clarity of the quipu, where every knot had a place and a purpose, was replaced by the opaque and often contradictory demands of colonial administrators. A person's obligations were no longer part of a visible, tangible system of give and take, but were dictated by unseen forces and unreadable papers, creating a pervasive sense of powerlessness. This was not merely the destruction of an accounting system, it was the erasure of a world's memory. The quipus held the genealogies of communities, the historical records of famines and surpluses, the precise measures of land and labor that formed the basis of social justice within the empire. When these knotted records were burned or left to rot, centuries of accumulated knowledge vanished. It was a deliberate severing of the people from their own past, making them easier to control. The intricate, data-driven understanding of how to sustain life in the Andes was discarded, leaving a void that would be filled by exploitation and mismanagement. The silence that followed was profound. The quiet hum of a continent-spanning bureaucracy, a system that connected the farmer in his field to the Sapa Inca in Cusco through a silent language of colored strings, ceased. The stories of these three systems, clay, wax, and knots, each emerge from a specific place and time, yet they reveal a shared human impulse to record, to count, and to control. They are parallel solutions to the universal problems of complexity and scale that arise whenever a society grows beyond the limits of individual memory. But looking closer at their mechanics and their fates highlights the profoundly different paths these civilizations took. The choice of medium was not arbitrary. It reflected and reinforced the core values and priorities of each culture, shaping everything from their economic life to their conception of history itself. Sumerian cuneiform, impressed into tablets of wet clay, represented a profound commitment to permanence. The raw material was abundant along the Tigris and Euphrates, a gift of the riverbanks. Once shaped, inscribed, and baked in a kiln, a record became as durable as stone, impervious to water and decay. This near indestructibility suited a civilization preoccupied with cosmic order, divine decrees, and legal codes intended to last for generations. The archives of Uruk or Lagash were not just temporary notes, they were a permanent, unchangeable accounting of the city's relationship with its gods and its own history. A single baked tablet could survive for millennia, carrying a mundane list of sheep or a king's proclamation into the far future. This physical endurance created a deep sense of continuity, a belief that the administrative acts of the present were being etched into the permanent record of the world. In stark contrast, the Roman wax tablet embodied ephemerality. Its greatest feature was not its durability, but its reusability. A stylus could scratch notes into the softened beeswax, and the flat end of the same tool could smooth the surface clean, ready for a new entry. This system was perfectly adapted to the dynamic, high-tempo world of Roman commerce, military logistics, and daily administration. It allowed for quick calculations, temporary lists, and messages that needed to be sent and then erased. For the Romans, permanence was a specialized need, reserved for monumental inscriptions or important legal documents written on expensive papyrus. The Incan quipu existed in a third, unique category. The physical object itself, made of spun and plied cotton or camelid fiber, was durable and could last for centuries in the dry Andean air. The knots, once tied, were a persistent form of data storage. However, the meaning of that data, the context that turned abstract numbers into a census or a tribute record, was held in the trained memory of the Quipucamayok. The Quipu was a system of persistent data with a volatile living key, a fusion of tangible object and intangible human knowledge. These fundamental differences in design have led to very different legacies. From Mesopotamia, we have inherited vast, almost overwhelming archives of administrative minutiae, allowing us to reconstruct the daily economic life of cities from 5,000 years ago. From Rome, we have a more scattered record, the important things that were carved in stone or written on papyrus, supplemented by the chance survival of a few wooden tablets that escaped recycling, giving us brief, personal glimpses into everyday transactions. From the Inca, we are left with a largely indecipherable data set, a collection of intricately knotted cords whose precise meanings vanished with the last of their keepers. Beyond the physical nature of the medium, we must consider the immense cognitive load required to operate these non-digital databases. Each system placed a unique and heavy strain on the mind of the ancient bookkeeper, demanding a kind of mental discipline that is difficult to imagine in our age of automated calculation. The internal world of these specialists was a landscape of memorized codes, mental maps, and practiced procedures. Their work was not simply a matter of writing or tying knots. It was a constant, active process of holding a complex, abstract system entirely within their own consciousness. Picture the Sumerian scribe, his mind a living library of hundreds of cuneiform signs, each with multiple phonetic and logographic meanings. He must recall the correct symbol from a vast mental inventory, orient it correctly, and press it into the damp clay with precisely the right amount of pressure. All of this happens under the relentless pressure of a drying medium. He might use a counting board or an abacus to aid in the raw calculation, but the logic, the cross-checking of figures, the conversion of different currencies, the tracking of expected versus actual revenue, all of this occurs within his own mind. He must build a mental model of the province's finances, holding numerous variables in his head simultaneously. A single mistake in his mental arithmetic could lead to a significant shortfall or an erroneous accusation of corruption. The integrity of the imperial financial system rested on the focused, disciplined minds of thousands of such men. The Quipucamayok, however, arguably faced the most daunting cognitive challenge of all. He was not merely reading or writing a pre-existing code. His memory was an essential part of the system itself. He had to be a living index for the knotted cords draped before him. For each quipu, he had to remember what category of thing was being counted: people, llamas, bushels of maize. He had to know which pendant cord corresponded to which village or family, and what the color coding signified in that specific context. This was not the recall of a static script, but the active maintenance of a vast, multi-dimensional mental database. This profound reliance on highly trained human minds fundamentally shaped the structure of ancient power. It created and sustained a specialized class of people whose value to the state was not their lineage, their wealth, or their strength in battle, but the sheer capacity and organization of their memory. These administrators, scribes, and record keepers formed the invisible scaffolding that held their civilizations together. They were the nodes in the network through which information flowed, the gatekeepers of the state's knowledge of itself. In all three civilizations, control over the administrative system was synonymous with control over the society. The ability to accurately count, track, and retrieve information about people, goods, and obligations was the absolute bedrock of political authority. An army can conquer territory, but only an administration can govern it. Without reliable records, a state cannot effectively tax its population, provision its armies, or manage its resources. The abstract symbols on clay, the tallies on wax, and the knots on a string were the true instruments of power, translating the ruler's will into tangible, organized action across vast distances. The Sumerian temple priests, for instance, derived much of their authority from their exclusive role as the keepers of the grain accounts. By controlling the records of who had deposited what and who was owed what, they controlled the economic lifeblood of the city-state. Likewise, Roman senators and emperors depended entirely on their network of literate administrators to manage the immense flow of tax revenues from the provinces, which funded the legions and the state itself. The cognitive load on these ancient accountants was immense, yet devoid of emotional drama. Their daily work was not a story of heroic deeds or passionate conflict, but one of quiet, sustained concentration. It was a mental marathon of memorization and precision, repeating the same careful motions and calculations hour after hour, day after day. The emotional landscape of the scribe was one of diligence, a constant, low-level vigilance against the entropy of error. There was no glory in getting the tally right, only the quiet satisfaction of a balanced ledger and the ever-present risk of censure for a mistake. Let us consider the specific actions of a Sumerian scribe tasked with recording a grain delivery. He would first take a prepared piece of damp, smooth clay, holding it carefully in his palm. From a pot of water he might moisten his fingers to prevent sticking. He would then select a stylus, a piece of reed cut to a specific triangular point. With a practiced hand, he would press the stylus into the clay, not drawing but impressing. A series of short, wedge-shaped marks would form the symbol for barley. Beside it, another set of impressions for the number of sacks, then the symbol for the temple granary, and finally a mark for the official who received the goods. Once completed, this small tablet, a single data point in a vast economic system, would be set out to dry in the sun or baked in a kiln for permanence. It would then be filed, perhaps in a wicker basket or on a wooden shelf inside a dedicated archive room, alongside hundreds of other similar tablets from that day. At the end of a week or a month, a senior scribe would undertake the laborious task of collation. He would gather all the relevant daily tablets and, on a much larger summary tablet, carefully transcribe and add up the totals, creating a monthly report of all barley received. The direct consequence of this meticulous and, perhaps to us, tedious labor was not fame or fortune, but simple, functional stability. Correctly tallied grain accounts meant that temple dependents received their proper rations. It ensured that the amount of seed set aside for the next planting season was sufficient. It allowed priests to track which farmers had fulfilled their tribute obligations and which had not. The entire predictable rhythm of the agricultural economy, the foundation of the city-state itself, rested upon the accuracy of these endless individual clay records. On a grander scale, this relentless accumulation of data created a form of institutional memory. By reviewing the summary tablets from years past, temple and palace administrators could engage in long-term planning. They could identify patterns such as a slow decline in the yield from a certain group of fields, or a steady increase in the consumption of beer. This allowed them to make informed decisions, to order the digging of a new irrigation canal, to adjust ration amounts, or to plan for a potential famine. The state was not just reacting to the present, it was learning from its recorded past. This fundamental principle, that aggregated data is the bedrock of state power, was by no means confined to Mesopotamia. Thousands of years later and thousands of miles to the west, the Roman Empire operated on the very same axiom. The materials were different: wax tablets for fleeting notes, papyrus scrolls for permanent archives. But the cognitive demands on the administrative class were strikingly parallel. The Roman administrator, like his Sumerian predecessor, was a master of a specialized, abstract system for tracking the real world. At the heart of this system was the tabularium, the official records office found in every major Roman city and, most importantly, in the capital itself. These buildings were not dusty, forgotten archives. They were bustling centers of information management. Clerks, often highly educated slaves or freedmen, spent their days receiving, processing, and filing a constant stream of documents. Reports from provincial governors, tax receipts from publicani, supply requisitions from legionary quartermasters, all of it flowed into the tabularium to be sorted, summarized, and stored. A provincial census serves as a powerful illustration of this system in action. The process was a monumental undertaking. Officials, backed by military authority, would systematically move through a province, compelling the head of every household to declare his name, his family members, their ages, and a detailed inventory of his property. This was not a simple head count, it was a rigorous assessment of the total human and economic resources available to the state, a spreadsheet of an entire population's wealth. Action. The Sumerian temple priests, for example, maintained their authority not through force alone, but by being the sole keepers of the grain accounts that dictated the city's survival. In Rome, senators and emperors could not personally oversee every corner of their domain. They relied entirely on their network of literate administrators to manage the vast provinces and channel their immense tax revenues back to the capital. For the Sapa Inca, this information monopoly was the very essence of his absolute power. The Quipu network, managed by his loyal Quipuka Mayox, provided a near real-time god's-eye view of his empire. He knew how many people lived in a distant mountain village, how much wool its llamas produced, and how many days of labor its people owed to the state. No provincial governor or potential rival could ever hope to match this comprehensive awareness. It made centralized control possible across a vast and difficult geography, cementing an authority that seemed as much divine as it was political. The knots and cords were not merely records, they were instruments of an unchallengeable, all-seeing imperial will. But the legacy of these ancient bookkeepers is not confined to their dusty tablets or fragile knotted cords. The fundamental principles they painstakingly developed are still with us, humming away quietly inside the digital systems that manage the modern world. Their work forms the invisible foundation of our own complex society. Consider a modern data center. In a vast, climate-controlled room, a low, constant hum emanates from endless racks of servers. Blinking lights signify the flow of information, a torrent of data that would have been unimaginable to an ancient scribe. Yet this facility, holding petabytes of information, is a direct, albeit vastly more complex, descendant of the Ebla archive or the Roman tabularium. The core concept of a database, a structured set of data held in a computer, organized for efficient retrieval, is a direct evolution of the Sumerian archive house. When a programmer writes a SQL query to pull specific information from a server, they are performing the modern equivalent of a scribe walking to a specific shelf, guided by catalog tablets, to find the record of a single barley transaction from 3 seasons past. The Roman penchant for standardization and distributed data entry, meanwhile, is mirrored in the vast corporate and government bureaucracies of today. A clerk in a local tax office entering property assessments into a centralized government system is performing the exact same function as a Roman quaestor in Gaul, filling out a standardized papyrus form for a census to be sent back to Rome. And the Incan quipu, with its purely abstract quantitative nature, prefigures the binary code that underpins all digital information. It is a profound demonstration that complex data processing does not strictly require a written linguistic analog. A system of knots, colors, and positions can be just as powerful as a system of letters, proving that the logic of data management transcends any single medium. There is a quiet, profound beauty in this continuity. The same fundamental human need to track, to count, to organize, and to remember connects a young Sumerian apprentice nervously pressing his first stylus into wet clay to a modern data scientist designing an algorithm to sort through billions of data points. The tools have changed beyond recognition, from clay and cord to silicon and light. But the essential cognitive work, the imposition of abstract order onto the messy details of reality, has remained remarkably and reassuringly the same. This exploration of non-digital databases reveals the immense, often invisible, effort that has always been required to hold civilizations together. The practical mechanics of their systems were mundane, the daily tasks repetitive and devoid of glory. But their collective consequences were nothing short of profound. Imagine the 3 bookkeepers together in a single quiet room. The Sumerian scribe sits with his damp clay tablet and sharpened reed. The Roman merchant holds a hinged wax tablet and a pointed stylus. The Incan Quipucamayok drapes a cascade of colored cords over his hands. They cannot speak to each other, but they would immediately understand the nature of each other's work. Their systems and the tireless, meticulous labor they represent allowed for the growth of cities beyond the scale of a single village. They enabled the management of continent-spanning empires and the creation of complex societies that could plan for the future, enforce laws, and mobilize resources on a massive scale. Without their boring, essential work, the grand histories of kings, generals, and conquests would simply be impossible. The history of bookkeeping is the history of civilization's plumbing. It is unseen, unglamorous, and taken for granted by those who benefit from it. When it works, no one notices. When it fails, the entire structure is threatened. It is a quiet testament to the persistent human drive to impose order on a chaotic world, to find patterns in the noise, and to build a lasting memory for a society that is larger than any single person's mind. It is the story of progress, told one number, one symbol, one knot at a time. Ultimately, these ancient systems are a powerful reminder that technology is not exclusively about silicon and electricity. Technology is any tool that extends human capability. In this light, a knotted cord, a wax-filled tablet, or a piece of shaped and fired clay can be, and was, a sophisticated and revolutionary information processing device. The legacy of these ancient administrative systems is woven into the very fabric of our modern world. Every time we check a bank statement, consult a spreadsheet, or rely on a government census, we are engaging with the direct descendants of these first organizational tools. The fundamental principles have not changed. The need for accountability, the importance of verification, and the power of a persistent external memory. The tools have evolved from clay and reeds to silicon and light, but the underlying logic remains. A transaction must be recorded, an inventory must be tracked, a debt must be remembered. The quiet work of the Sumerian scribe echoes in the silent processing of a modern server, both performing the essential task of maintaining a trusted record of a complex reality. We can imagine the weight of this responsibility on the shoulders of the ancient bookkeeper. In a world without digital backups, a single mistake, a cracked tablet, a misplaced knot could have significant consequences. An entire village's grain supply, a temple's assets, or a merchant's fortune rested on their diligence and integrity. There must have been a profound, quiet satisfaction in their work, the feeling of a completed tally where everything balances perfectly, the creation of a clear, unambiguous record from a messy reality. This was not just a job, it was an act of creating order, of building a small, stable island of certainty in a vast ocean of chaos and forgetfulness. It was the foundation of trust. As we draw our journey through these quiet administrative histories to a close, we can see the common thread that connects the quipu of the Andes to the papyrus scrolls of the Nile. It is not just about counting things, it is about the fundamental human impulse to understand, to organize, and to remember. It is the drive to create systems that can outlast a single human life, to build a collective memory that allows a society to grow, to learn, and to endure. Let us drift back one last time into the silent rooms where this foundational work was done, and feel the deep, abiding peace of this ancient, essential task. Picture a storeroom at dusk in ancient Egypt. The air is thick with the dry, sweet scent of papyrus and the faint aroma of ink. Outside, the sounds of the day are fading, replaced by the gentle hum of insects. Inside, a lone scribe works by the flickering golden light of a single oil lamp. His only companion is the soft whisper of his reed pen as it glides across the sheet, leaving behind neat columns of hieratic script. This is not a place of grand pronouncements or heroic deeds. It is a sanctuary of quiet concentration, a place where the intricate business of a kingdom is rendered into a calm, orderly, and permanent form. The ultimate consequence of this tireless, often anonymous labor is history itself. The grand tales of pharaohs and emperors are built upon the foundation of these mundane records. Without the lists of rations, the tax receipts, and the inventories of goods, our understanding of the past would be a collection of myths and legends. These administrative documents are the raw data of civilization. They provide the unglamorous, factual bedrock that allows us to reconstruct daily life, to understand ancient economies, and to see these long-vanished worlds not as fantastical realms but as real places, populated by real people concerned with the practical, everyday business of living. And so there is a deep and profound comfort in this continuity. The knowledge that for thousands of years individuals have dedicated themselves to this same quiet pursuit of order. Their names are almost all lost to us. They were not kings or conquerors, but their collective work was just as vital. Their legacy is the very possibility of a complex, stable society. It is a silent, enduring testament to the power of meticulous, collaborative effort. As we rest, we can feel a connection to that long, unbroken chain of quiet diligence, a rhythm of careful work that has ticked along like a steady heartbeat beneath the surface of history. In the end, the true marvel is not any single tablet or knotted cord, but the concept of the system itself. The idea that information could be abstracted, encoded, and stored reliably was a cognitive leap as significant as the invention of the wheel or the control of fire. It allowed human societies to overcome the limitations of individual memory and build something far larger and more permanent. From these simple beginnings, a mark for a sheep, a knot for a measure of grain, grew the entire architecture of global administration, law, and knowledge. It is the quiet, unassuming, and deeply boring foundation upon which everything else is built, and in this we find a profound and soothing lesson. The grand narratives of history, with their heroes and villains, are built upon a foundation of countless, uncelebrated acts of administrative diligence. It is the history of the rule, not the exception, the story of normalcy, of the thousand small, correct actions that allow a society to simply continue. There is a deep peace in this. It is the quiet confidence that the granaries are full, that the debts are recorded, that the world will be much the same tomorrow as it is today. This is not the stuff of epics, but it is the very essence of civilization. This ancient impulse to record and organize is a current that runs through all of human history, connecting the Sumerian scribe with the modern database administrator. The tools have evolved from clay and reeds to silicon and light, but the fundamental task remains unchanged. It is the patient, methodical effort to impose a logical structure onto the messy reality of human affairs. It is the belief that by counting, listing, and cross-referencing, we can create a small pocket of clarity and predictability in a vast and often chaotic universe. As the mind begins to quiet, we can find comfort in the work of these distant, anonymous figures. Their labor was a bulwark against uncertainty. Every tallied sheep, every measured field, every recorded transaction was a small victory for order. It was an affirmation that things could be known, managed, and secured. This feeling of security, the sense that everything is in its proper place and accounted for, is the very foundation of rest. It is the permission the mind needs to let go of its worries and drift into sleep. Let the final thought be of that quiet, repetitive work, the gentle tap of a stylus on a moist clay tablet, the methodical tying of knots in a cord, the soft brush of ink on papyrus. In Sumer, the very complexity of cuneiform ensured that literacy remained the exclusive domain of a specialized, highly trained elite. This scribal caste was more than just a group of clerks. It was a permanent institution, a central pillar of state power that managed everything from the inventories of temple granaries to the wording of royal decrees. This bureaucratic structure proved so effective that it became one of Sumer's most enduring exports. The model of a professional administrative class, with its rigorous schools, its internal hierarchies, and its standardized practices, was adopted and adapted by subsequent Mesopotamian empires, from the Akkadians to the Babylonians, persisting for nearly 2 millennia. Unlike the centralized scribal schools of Mesopotamia, Roman record-keeping was more widely distributed across society. The relative simplicity of tools like wax tablets and papyrus allowed merchants, soldiers, and local officials to participate directly in a culture of documentation, fostering a society accustomed to thinking in terms of recorded evidence. From this widespread practice emerged a deeply legalistic and commercial mindset. The principles of the written contract, the public ledger, and the verifiable receipt were not abstract legal theories but daily realities. This practical, decentralized approach to documentation became a cornerstone of Roman law and, through it, a foundational element of Western legal traditions. The Incan state, managed through the Quipu, was a marvel of organization, but it possessed a critical vulnerability. The entire system was keyed to the memories of the Quipucamayos. The chords held the numbers, but the context, what those numbers represented, resided within a trained human mind. The state's knowledge was not in an archive, but in a living network of specialists. When the Spanish conquest decapitated this administrative class, the consequence was not just a loss of personnel, but a catastrophic institutional failure. The empire's memory was effectively erased. A text-based civilization might have preserved fragments of its knowledge, but for the Inca, the loss of the key holders rendered the data on the Quipus inert, accelerating a swift and total collapse. Each of these three systems operated at a different level of abstraction, a different relationship between the symbol and its meaning. Sumerian cuneiform, even in its most efficient form, was fundamentally tied to the sounds and words of a spoken language. Each symbol represented a syllable or an idea, linking the record directly to speech. The Roman alphabet offered a higher degree of abstraction, with letters representing phonemes that could be flexibly assembled to write various languages. The Incan quipu represented the highest level of all. Its knots and colors were pure data, completely divorced from any specific language. It was a system of numbers and categories, a true database whose meaning was layered on top by its human user. Consider a simple transaction. A Sumerian scribe, recording a delivery for a religious festival, might impress symbols into clay that read, 20 jars of beer for the festival of Inanna. The record contains both the quantity and the full context. A Roman quartermaster might scrawl on a wax tablet a more abbreviated note, XX amphori, with the context implied but not explicit. The Quipucamayok, recording the same information, would tie a series of knots on a specific chord to represent the number 20. The chord's color or its position within a larger arrangement would signify that the items were jars of chicha beer. The final piece of information, that they were for a festival, might be stored only in his memory to be recounted later. This fundamental difference in how data was bound to its meaning directly shaped the legacy each system left behind. Because Sumerian cuneiform was tied to language, its records, once deciphered, provide a rich, detailed window into their culture, religion, and daily life. The Roman records are more functional, telling us a great deal about law and commerce. The Incan record, stripped of its human interpreters, is the most enigmatic. We are left with a vast collection of pure data, precise, organized, and complex. But without the key that resided in the minds of the Quipucamayos, it remains a collection of numbers, a silent testament to a sophisticated system whose full voice we can no longer hear. This difference can be thought of as levels of data abstraction. The Sumerian cuneiform system operated at a very low level of abstraction. The symbols were directly tied to language and the objects they represented. The sign for a sheep looked a bit like a sheep's head, and the word for sheep was spoken aloud. The record was a direct, albeit stylized, transcript of a real-world event captured in the medium of language. This made the information robust and self-contained. The individual record was a piece of a puzzle, and its full meaning was derived from its position within that puzzle. The Incan quipu, however, represents the highest level of abstraction. The data, the numbers encoded in knots, was completely separated from its meaning. The knots for 30 were just a numerical concept, not the word 30. The meaning was applied externally through the color, texture, and placement of the chords, and most critically, through the memory of the trained official.